The Grand Duke and Diamonds. Narrated by Art Litera in collaboration with Luton Who Heritage and authored by Raleigh Trevelyan. Part 12. Pinnacle of Achievement. The friendship between Julius Wernher and the formidable Fabians, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, might come as a surprise. The introduction was made through R.B., later Lord, Haldane, a Liberal member for East Lothian, in relation to the Charlottesburg scheme. By 1902, Sidney had joined Haldane in a plan to create a college for higher technical and scientific training as part of London University, akin to the Charlottesburg Institute in Berlin. According to Haldane's autobiography, the Prince Consort had originally envisioned using the Great Exhibition site for such a project. This idea was further championed by the Prince of Wales, who became even more enthusiastic upon ascending the throne. Although a grant had finally been obtained from the Treasury, it proved insufficient. Consequently, Haldane approached Julius, known to him as a public-spirited man of German origin, impressed with the concept of German scientific training. At the Wernher Beat office, Haldane also met Beat, who was so highly appreciative that he immediately offered £100,000. This encounter led Haldane to meet Cecil Rhodes, presumably just before his death, and this opened doors to promises of help from Lord Rothschild and other South African friends, including Sir Ernest Cassel. Julius subsequently became a member of the Haldane Committee. Given the rising rivalry with Germany and the need to expand the fleet, this project appeared even more urgent. Furthermore, there was an increasing demand for various metals, many of which were produced or financed under the auspices of Wernher Beat. As Julius himself stated, British youth in mining camps worldwide should not be disadvantaged when competing with Germans. On the 7th of February 1905, the Webbs hosted a dinner party for Sir Oliver Lodge, the distinguished physicist and principal of Birmingham University. The guest list included Prime Minister A.J. Balfour, Bertrand Russell and his wife Alice, Fabian Lyon Phillimore, the handsome actor-producer Harley Granville Barker, who was staging Shaw's plays, and H.J. Mackinder, director of the London School of Economics. Bertrand Russell wrote to a friend about the gathering. Greatest of all was Wernher of Wernher Beat and Company, the chief of all the South African millionaires, a fat, good-natured, eupeptic German with an equally fat gold watch chain and a strong German accent characteristic of all the finest types of British imperialists, bearing very lightly the load of blood, of nations destroyed and hatreds generated, of Chinese slavery and English corruption, which, by all the old rules, ought to weigh upon him like a cope of lead. It was an amusing occasion. When everyone had come except Balfour and Wernher, Mrs. Webb observed that we should see which of them thought himself the bigger swell, by which came last. Sure enough, Wernher came last, for though Balfour governs the empire, Wernher governs Balfour. Beatrice Webb seated Balfour and Russell next to one another, and they seemed to get along well, although Russell considered Balfour to be weak, albeit kind and not at all headstrong. She sacrificed herself to the millionaire, Julius. In her typically sharp manner, she noticed Balfour's subtle antipathy towards Mackinder and Julius, whom he might regard as mere Philistine materialist administrators. After Julius's death, some obituaries listed Balfour, along with Chamberlain, Rosebery, Asquith, and Haldane, as among his friends, indicating that their friendship might have developed later. Or perhaps, given the looming threat of a general election, and the sins attributed to Julius by Russell, there was some passing unease at such a confrontation. Julius, however, would have been less troubled. He considered himself a wobbler in politics, alternating his allegiance between the Conservatives and the Liberals. In Johannesburg, he admitted to Samuel Evans that cultivating friendships within a Liberal government was necessary. We cannot be without friends in a Liberal government. Personally, we know the probable leaders almost more intimately than members of the present government, and they would always be prepared to listen to us. Beatrice observed that Julius and Mackinder chummed up and walked away together. It took some time for the Webbs to fully appreciate Julius. Perhaps it was a case of knowing where their bread was buttered. In October 1905, she hosted another party and noted in her diary, "On Tuesday, we had dinner with Julius 𝒂, the South African capitalist, a heavy-set, good-natured, public-spirited, and scientific-minded millionaire. Our guests included Lord Lytton, Bernard Shaw, and Mrs. Prothero. The spouses of these three were unwell. It was a somewhat mismatched gathering that required considerable effort on my part to ensure it became a comfortable affair." 𝒂 stumbled heavily through his broken German, while Shaw scintillated. Mrs. Prothero, wife of the co-editor of the Cambridge Modern History, listened with Irish skepticism and wit, while Lord Lytton, the beautiful and fastidious young artist and aristocrat, hung on Shaw's every word. It was an assembly of interesting types, but they did not mix well. It was not until May 1906 that the Webbs accepted an invitation from the Julius 𝒂s at Bath House. Beatrice noted in her diary that this was partly due to the 𝒖𝒕𝒉 project, but also because they were curious to see the inside of such an establishment, and because they liked and respected the man. She described him as a German giant, not unduly self-indulgent, and a real drudge at his business. She further praised his public-spiritedness, generosity, and sense of responsibility towards the South African commercial world, highlighting how he perpetually carried the weaker men on his back. She observed that he was good to his own community and had no social ambitions to leverage his wealth. 𝒂 himself admitted, "I have no time even to know that I am wealthy. The only result of my millions is to make me dread being introduced to a new person lest they should begin to beg from me. The really happy person is the man with £10,000 a year, reputed to have £2,000. Also in May, Julius wrote to Sidney and Beatrice, offering them the use of the house known as the Hermitage within his Luton estate for as long as they cared to stay. It is a splendid irony that in these luxurious surroundings, they wrote their famous Minority Report for the Royal Commission on the Poor Law. The excuse, of course, was Julius's commitment to the 𝒖𝒕𝒉 scheme. A few months earlier, Sidney had been invited by Julius to an important dinner for 30 men, mainly focused on 𝒖𝒕𝒉, but also including some financiers. Attendees included Haldane, Sidney Holland, later Lord Knutsford, the hospital reformer, Mowat, the permanent secretary to the Treasury, Morant, the permanent secretary to the Board of Education, Siemens, the electrical engineer, and Sir Felix Schuster, the banker. Not surprisingly, Sidney Webb came around to thinking that Julius was the best of fellows according to his own lights. Beatrice wrote, "Hence, we felt free to accept his hospitality." Beatrice could not resist small critiques in her diary. The 𝒂s has only visited Luton, who on occasional Sundays and for a few months in the autumn. To maintain the estate, there were 54 gardeners, 10 electricians, 20 to 30 house servants, and numerous labourers, to nobody's benefit, except that it furnishes dishonest pickings to all concerned. According to the Luton News, there were 4,000 potted carnations in the conservatories. Beatrice wrote, "The grand mansion stood closed and silent, no one coming or going except for the retinue of servants. The only noises were the perpetual whirring and calling of thousands of pheasants, ducks, and other game fattening for the autumn slaughter. Just half a mile away, at the gates of the park, lay the crowded town of Luton, a place of drunkenness, sensuality, disorder, and appalling infant mortality rates. The stark contrast was oppressively unpleasant and haunted our thoughts as we sat under the glorious trees, roamed through the woods and garden, used their carriages, enjoyed their fruits, flowers, and vegetables, and lived for a brief interval amid the extravagant expenditure of £30,000 a year on a country house alone." Haunted thoughts or not, Sidney and Beatrice Webb returned to the Hermitage 3 years later, toiling at their book on destitution. They found that Luton, who was conveniently close to the Bernard Shaws, and Beatrice noted visits from George Lansbury, the future leader of the Labour Party, and then MP for Bow and Bromley. The Webbs, however, missed the excitement of Ford Madox Ford, then known as 𝒂𝒓, and Douglas Goldring visiting Joseph Conrad at Summary's farm, across the park, which led to the birth of the English Review in December 1908. To Beatrice, Julius had bought Luton Who to please his society-loving wife, and she was not entirely wrong. When she first met Birdie, she found her a hard, vainglorious woman, talkative and badly bred, though not otherwise objectionable. Later, she revised her opinion and found Birdie to be not a bad sort, an able woman with a clever tongue, direct and good-natured by disposition, but a slave to the consciousness of her wealth, which made her restless, rushing from place to place. Beatrice observed that Lady Wernher's thoughts centred on the admiration of others for her millions. Consequently, Birdie was essentially ugly both in person and manners, her dress crude in colour and outre in form, covered with extravagant and ill-assorted jewels, her talk solely about herself and her possessions, and her expression a curious mix of boldness and uneasiness. To be fair to Birdie, a different assessment of her character appeared in the African World, a journal likely sycophantic towards the landlords. An article published that same year referred to her sweet womanly benevolence, which benefited the flotsam and jetsam of civilization, the children of mean streets. She tried, as she said, to pull my weight in Luton and sponsored several good works. She opened the new secondary school, contributed to new hospital wards, showed interest in the straw plaiting industry for which Luton was renowned, and made her sons wear straw hats whenever they drove through the town. Julius, as the new lord of the manor, immediately gave up some of his medieval rights and sold the freehold of the Corn Exchange to the town. He also made speeches at the court-lete dinners, where his jokes were suitably appreciated. The straw platers had been introduced to Luton by James I, originally brought from the reign by his mother, Mary Queen of Scots. They were sent to Luton because Bedfordshire was a good straw and wheat country. The Luton Who farms provided some of the straw. The population of Luton was approximately 50,000. In mid-Victorian times, the town remained somewhat of a backwater due to a disagreement with Stevenson regarding the construction of the railway. Local vested interests had obstructed its development. However, following the First and Second World Wars, Luton underwent significant industrial transformation. Some of these changes were arguably due to the inherited wealth and energy of Julius Wernher's descendants. Part of the Luton Who estate included the ruins of Summary's Castle, a late medieval fortified manor house. In the 18th century, its bricks were repurposed to build Summary's farm nearby. It was here, from September 1907 until March 1909. Joseph Conrad lived, probably unknown to the Wernhers, rather gloomily with his family while writing under Western eyes. During the summer of 1904, Birdie fell ill and had to spend a significant amount of time recuperating in Wiesbaden. She took great delight in her Italian garden at Luton Who. The upper terrace was adorned with annual flowers, while the lower terrace featured herbaceous plants and patterned beds surrounded by box hedges with topiary work. Much of Capability-Brown's careful arrangement of tree avenues and woodland coppices still existed, and some of the Lee's exotic trees, such as Californian madronas, tulip trees, and Himalayan juniper, had matured. Birdie added her favorite pink-flowered chestnut trees. As a surprise for her return from Wiesbaden, Julius constructed a large rock garden in a dell some distance from the house, with ponds filled with water lilies surrounded by ferns, irises, and conifers. This quiet, cool oasis contrasted with the sweeping grandeur of the lakes and landscaped park. By the time Birdie returned, enough work had been done to make Luton Who habitable, allowing her to host weekend house parties. She even organized a fancy dress ball. Had she lived longer, Birdie would have been proud of the comments on Luton Who in Nicolaus Pevsner's Penguin Buildings of Britain series. Pevsner admired the creation, stating that no one after the First World War could have been capable of such an achievement. He described Luton Who as a perfect example of Edwardian riches and French training of the highest quality. One of the first guests at a weekend house party at the refurbished Luton, who was Agnes Keyser, the founder of the King Edward VII Hospital for Officers. This petite figure, known for her impeccable attire, was a friend of the king, whom she idolized. She was the daughter of a stockbroker and had originally turned her house, 17 Grosvenor Crescent, into a hospital during the war, treating 250 patients. Afterwards, the king persuaded her to keep it open, stating that there was a need for such a facility in peacetime for officers who served in various climates worldwide. He suggested she call herself Sister Agnes, a name she was known by thereafter. Patients were treated free of charge, though a small fee was introduced later. Many royal and banking friends provided financial support. The Prince of Wales became president, but by 1904 more funds were needed and the South Africans were approached. Friede Eckstein donated £1,000, provided it was kept private. Shortly afterwards, Julius Wernher and Alfred Beat authorized a further £8,000, some in cash and some in Lisbon and Mexican tramways debentures. Lionel Phillips contributed £500 and indicated he would provide another £500 if necessary. The hospital moved to 9 Grosvenor Gardens, closer to Buckingham Palace and convenient for informal visits by the king. After such generosity towards two of the king's favoured projects, it was not surprising that His Majesty decided to confer a baronetcy on Julius in the 1905 birthday honours. The news was communicated in a letter from Balfour himself. Julius wrote to his brother-in-law Franz Mankiewicz, acknowledging that the honour might shock those with democratic tendencies. He explained that refusing it would have appeared rude and unwise, given their social relations and political connections. Bertie was less enthusiastic than expected. Julius's baronetcy was the first of several conferred on the South African magnates, and it was received with pleasure in the city, though not by the readers of Truth. However, there was family trouble involving Derek. On the 30th of May 1905, Julius expressed his concern about Derek's lack of ambition and character, fearing he might not rise above mediocrity. This was followed by another letter on the 14th of June, in which Julius lamented Derek's apathy and lack of shame or mortification. He concluded that Derek lacked discernment of what was right or wrong. 2 days later, Julius wrote again, expressing his unease about Derek and suggesting that he should see Dyer, Derek's Eton housemaster. These mysterious references are somewhat clarified by a letter from Dyer over a year later, after his retirement. It concerned boys in his house being involved in betting transactions with a tailor's assistant named Trotman, which resulted in the man's dismissal and ruin. Trotman's wife, who worked as a servant, revealed to her employer that the boy at the center of the scandal was named Wernher. Julius likely compensated Trotman immediately. Derek, with his usual charm, probably swore that such an incident would never occur again, and his mother believed him. Harold, it seems, continued to receive mediocre reports from school, but was still set to attend Eton in the autumn of 1907. Aware that his parents viewed him as the least promising of the trio, he grew close to his mother's secretary, Margie Price. He loved horses and was easily the most athletic of the brothers. As Derek began to put on weight and lost some of his good looks, Harold emerged as the most handsome. He also began to show an interest in the theatre. Harold was still very young, but his father had long sensed a complete indifference to anything related to South Africa. In contrast, the youngest Wernher boy, Alex, was undeniably brilliant and worked hard at school. He was the favorite of his uncle Franz, who was also fond of Harold. The main concern about Alex was his poor eyesight. However, Julius wrote to Bertie, "I have less fear for Dindal than any of our boys." Like all fashionable ladies, Alice, Lady Wernher, was painted by Sargent. The portrait was hung in the Pillared Hall at Luton Hoo. In 1905, Julius purchased the portrait of the Countess of Bellamont by Reynolds from Langton Davis, which was also hung at Luton Hoo. Many of the religious pictures, such as the Altdorfer, the Bermejo, and the Filipino Lippi, were kept at Bath House, along with most of the Hopner's and Reynolds's Lady Caroline Price. Birdie seems to have had a private collection of more modern pictures in her boudoir at Bath House, including works by Leighton, Frith, and J. Shannon, admittedly not her husband's taste. In 1905, Rodolphe Kahn died, and eager buyers quickly surrounded his vast and fabulous art collection in the Avenue d'Iéna. The Duveen father and sons, Bernard Berenson and Nathan Wildenstein, were among those interested. The trouble was that some of the collection was combined with that of Kahn's brother Maurice. Dr. Bode of Berlin was commissioned to create a catalogue. Fortunately for the dealers, Maurice died shortly afterward, allowing them to acquire the entire collection for the bargain price of $4.2 million. Pierpont Morgan had first pick, and Julius is believed to have secured an object or two, though details have been lost. In that spring, Julius and Birdie became friends with Grand Duke Michael of Russia and Countess Торби, who were caring for Russian officers wounded during the Russo-Japanese War. Grand Duke Michael also founded the Golf Club, of which he was president and Birdie was a patron. However, the main bond seemed to be between Harold and Alex and the Торbi children, Zia Anastasia, born on the 9th of September 1892, Nada Nadida, born in 1896, and Michael, known as Boy, born in 1898. The eventual link between the two families has been revealed in the prologue to this book, with more to be said later about Grand Duke Michael Mikhailovich Mika, Michel, or Mishmish, and the beautiful Countess Sophie de Торби. Their morganatic marriage led to his banishment from the imperial court and Russia. During this period, Russia was in a state of revolution, marked by events like Bloody Sunday and Battleship Potemkin. However, these tumultuous times did not greatly affect the behavior and lifestyle of the numerous Grand Dukes, including Grand Duke Michael's brothers, who resided in the south of France. Lloyd George was amazed at their reckless gambling during the darkest hours of their country's troubles. Grand Duke Serge bet hundreds of pounds at a time, while Grand Duke Nicholas was even more extravagant. Grand Duke Michael maintained a palatial residence in Cannes, the Villa Casbec, and for at least a quarter of the year, he lived in the Neo-Elizabethan Keel Hall in Staffordshire. There, he entertained his cousin Edward VII and Mrs. Keppel. Due to the financial strain from the Russo-Japanese War, he may have sought financial support from Julius Wernher. Grand Duke Michael and his wife were invited to Luton, who for a weekend in December 1906, during which there was a pheasant shoot with a bag of 451 birds. A photograph shows that it was an extremely cold weekend with snow. Other guests included the Siggy Newmans, Baron von Strum, and Lord Alwyn Compton. According to a society paper, the onlooker, Countess Торbi, left for the weekend looking radiantly handsome, wearing a wonderful hat seemingly worked with diamonds and rubies. The Luton Who Visitors book mentions that other weekend guests that winter included Prince Albert of Schleswig-Holstein, members of Sir Ernest Cassell's family, the distinguished soldier general Sir Arthur Paget, Lord Farquhar, master of the King's household, Major Vigand de Falb, related by marriage to Madame de Falb, and the Marquise de Hautpain. It is a wonder that Julius Wernher ever had any time for social life. Most of his real friends were connected to his business or his art collection. He played a little golf, shot pheasants at Luton Hoo, and occasionally spent 2 or 3 days with Birdie on the Riviera. He no longer attended the theatre or opera and preferred to read books in his leisure time. Lionel Phillips had second thoughts about a career in politics and, to Julius's relief, decided to return to Johannesburg on a so-called flying visit before making up his mind. He soon understood Julius's disquiet about the rudderless corner house. Added to this were anxieties arising from the voluntary departure in 1905 of Lord Milner, who realized that his grand design had failed and that his presence only added to the unrest. It had been noted in the city that Julius had been making frequent trips to Paris, leading to excited rumors about a significant new financial deal. Such rumors were grounded in reality. Given the circumstances, his visits to Cannes must have been very brief, leaving Birdie to concentrate on maintaining the grand ducal connections with tea at Rumpelmayer's with Countess Torby and receptions at the Club Nautique. After returning from Johannesburg, Julius discussed with 𝒉𝒆 the urgent need for much larger quantities of capital for deep-level mining, new machinery, and fresh amalgamation schemes. With gold shares in a depressed state, there were unique opportunities for acquiring bargains. The plan was to build upon the African Venture Syndicate with French support and to raise £6 million in capital. The new company, registered on the 9th of May 1905, was called the Central Mining and Investment Corporation. It caused a sensation. As A.P. Cartwright said in his book, Pierpont Morgan himself could never have flown so high. However, the strain and excitement led to another collapse for 𝒉𝒆. On the 5th of May, Julius informed Phillips that 𝒉𝒆 had fallen ill with kidney trouble and catarrh of the big bowel. With Fitzpatrick and now Schumacher also ill, Julius was desperate for Phillips to stay with the firm, saying, "If you leave us, we shall be miserably short." Half the capital of £6 million went to members of the African Venture Syndicate, which meant that 𝒉𝒏 owned £1,200,000. 𝒉𝒏 had retained 15% of the profits from the African Venture Syndicate. Since they were managers of Central Mining, they would now receive 25% of the surplus profits after payments to shareholders. In return, Central Mining was to receive a 30% interest in all new business undertaken by 𝒉𝒏, and had to offer the firm a 30% participation in any new capital raised for the mines it controlled. Thus, Central Mining was a partner in 𝒉𝒏, which was a partner in Central Mining, including all 𝒉𝒏's interests worldwide, not just in gold mining. Shares were not made available to the public, but were reserved for new interests, nearly all in France. The first directors were Julius 𝒉𝒏, Alfred 𝒉𝒆, and Friedrich Eckstein, and in France, their colleague Georges Rouliat and Count Isaac de Camondo. A.P. Cartwright noted that the creation of Central Mining marked the pinnacle of Julius as a financier. The City of London raised its hat to him and henceforth spoke of him with the respect that it normally reserved for the Rothschilds. The enormous success of this flotation soon faced setbacks. The Moroccan crisis and Kaiser William II's belligerence, followed by the fall in American stocks, had global repercussions. In December, Balfour resigned and Campbell Bannerman formed a new government, leading to a landslide election victory for the Liberals. The main issues were tariff reform and Chinese slavery. The liberal press highlighted the horrific conditions under which the Chinese worked, with headlines such as "Terror on the Rand" and "Horrible Cruelties, Deep Drilling 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 2 shillings a day, subjected to flogging with no access to courts of law." Electoral gimmicks included parades of men dressed as Chinamen in chains, accompanied by slave drivers with whips. Tories were taunted as pigtails. Haldane became Secretary of State for War, and the young Winston Churchill was Under-Secretary for the Colonies, making him the chief spokesman in the Commons under Lord Elgin. But gold shares, having recovered a little, began to slide. The Liberals had pledged to end the Chinese coolie system, but as Julius 𝒉𝒏 had anticipated, they found it impossible to do so for legal reasons. Not only were 50,000 Chinese already working in the mines under contract, but another 14,000 were on their way, with contracts for more to come. Although Churchill proposed a form of assisted repatriation, few coolies took advantage of it. Hostility to Chinese labor was not confined to Britain. Moneypenny, the editor of the Johannesburg Star, had resigned. White labourists, including the Cornish cousin Jacks, feared displacement. A new Boer party, 𝒖𝒕𝒊𝒄𝒂, the People, had formed in the Transvaal, led by Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, who saw the opportunity to draw some of their discontented former foes into the fold. The British government's decision to introduce responsible government in the Transvaal was viewed with apprehension by many leaders in the mining community, though 𝒁𝒑 and 𝒉𝒂𝒏 were less concerned. Lionel Phillips finally decided to abandon politics and return permanently to Johannesburg, likely influenced by his personal finances and his wife's extravagant tastes. Perhaps he realized that 𝒖𝒕𝒉 real aim was to avenge defeat and destroy the dream of a British South Africa. His energy and enthusiasm were much needed at the corner house, and Florey returned to the scene of her triumphs in February. Maurice Rouvia, the former supporter of 𝒁𝒑 and 𝒉𝒂𝒏, had now ascended to the role of Prime Minister of France. In November, 𝒉𝒂𝒏, somewhat recovered, visited Rouvia in Paris and sensed an imminent war with Germany by the end of February. Shortly after, 𝒉𝒂𝒏 received an unexpected invitation from the Kaiser. The official reason was to award him the Order of the Red Eagle for his generosity towards the Berlin Museum, possibly influenced by Bode's message that 𝒉𝒂𝒏 was neglecting Berlin in favor of the London National Gallery. To appease the Kaiser, 𝒉𝒂𝒏 purchased several paintings, including a Van Dyck, that Bode desired. As a British subject, 𝒉𝒂𝒏 declined the order without causing offence. The Kaiser mistakenly identified him as Sir Ernest Cassel, referring to 𝒉𝒂𝒏 as the speculator of Edward VII and his notorious stock exchange crony. During their meeting, discussions on Morocco and tariff reform dominated. 𝒉𝒂𝒏 suggested that tariff reform would benefit Britain, prompting a menacing response from the Kaiser. If England builds tariff walls around her empire, I shall have to decide whether England should be allowed to retain her colonies. The Kaiser also inquired about Britain's readiness to deploy 100,000 men in Schleswig-Holstein, which 𝒉𝒂𝒏 dismissed as nonsense. He also accused the British of financing anti-German articles in the Paris press, a claim with some truth. Despite the Kaiser's intimidating demeanor, 𝒉𝒂𝒏 maintained his independence and composure during the interview. His meeting with the Kaiser underscored 𝒉𝒂𝒏's international renown and the reputation of his firm. 𝒉𝒂𝒏 conveyed to Julius that he believed the Kaiser genuinely desired peace and was surprised by his extensive knowledge. Upon 𝒉𝒂𝒏's return, Lord Esher, on behalf of the king, sought a detailed account of the meeting. 𝒁𝒑, meanwhile, informed Phillips of 𝒉𝒂𝒏's improved condition and regular visits. However, this positive spell was short-lived as pessimism gripped the city following the Conservative Unionists' defeat and the rise of the Labour Party, which threatened South African affairs. 𝒉𝒂𝒏 and Julius welcomed a surprise visit from Smuts, and in correspondence with Fitzpatrick, now the leader of the Progressive Party in Johannesburg, Julius noted Smuts's suggestion for capitalists to reach a private agreement with 𝒖𝒕𝒉 for a more lenient stance on Chinese labor. Though initially rejected, the growing controversy over Chinese labor made the proposal more appealing. They recognized Smuts as a pragmatic negotiator. In a decisive letter to Fitzpatrick, one of his last, 𝒉𝒂𝒏 ruled out the idea of a progressive government led by Fitzpatrick, arguing that Fitzpatrick would always be publicly associated with the firm. 𝒉𝒂𝒏 and 𝒁𝒑𝒑 preferred Sir Richard Solomon, an independent of mining interests, to lead the party. This was a significant blow to Fitzpatrick's political aspirations. Julius's increasing gloom amid falling share values was evident in a letter to Phillips on the 15th of February 1906. The animosity toward the Chinese was palpable, whether genuine or fabricated. Reflecting on their significant sacrifices and immense responsibilities, many viewed 𝒉𝒂𝒏 and his colleagues as the final hope for countless individuals. They faced severe losses and were perceived as either fools or scoundrels. Most people were indifferent as long as they were not inconvenienced financially, often taking malicious delight in the capitalists' losses. The potential closure of the mines would be catastrophic, and without a substantial increase in British descendants, the situation seemed hopeless. Lord Milner's efforts were hampered by the lack of willing interlocutors, and attempting to communicate might have caused more harm. The constant blame took a toll on 𝒉𝒂𝒏, leading to frequent states of collapse. Describing the week as beastly, he expressed concern over possible financial disasters, with losses being severe enough to induce panic. Prepared for almost any eventuality, he lamented that their sacrifices seemed futile, resulting in many people being completely ruined with no hope of recovery. He acknowledged their fault in allowing the situation to escalate to such a precarious state. Despite selling for a significant loss, as one jobber demonstrated, central mining was experiencing its trial by fire. Beat found some solace in Churchill's extremely clever speech in the Commons, which tried to balance sympathy for the Chinese with imperial responsibilities. The term terminological inexactitude was coined in this speech in relation to slavery. However, Churchill's stance on Milner, particularly regarding the authorized flogging of Chinese workers, caused outrage. Milner was being treated unfairly, with some using even stronger language to describe Churchill's actions. Julius maintained regular correspondence with Milner during this period, sending him Fitzpatrick's detailed letters from Johannesburg. The situation worsened with reports of murders and marauding gangs, as well as the shocking revelation of unnatural vices in the compounds due to the absence of workers' families. Venereal disease was rampant, and Churchill further upset people by using the word catamite in the House. Voluntary repatriation had failed, leading to calls for enforced repatriation of many professionals. On the 26th of March, Julius had troubling news for Phillips. Beat had suffered another stroke, resulting in paralysis on his left side. Beat appeared more apathetic and depressed than ever before. Julius described Beat as a hopeless case, unable to function without people around him. His house in Park Lane was always open to visitors, including brokers, and his indiscretions when feeling well only added to the sadness of the situation. Around this time, an article in the New York press contrasted Alfred Beat with his more lively younger brother Otto, who was close to the King and the Prince of Wales. Otto's house in Belgrave Square was one of the few in London where His Majesty would visit for cards and billiards. The article also included a piece about Julius Wernher, described as one of the most modest wealthy men in London. Wernher lived simply, dressing modestly, and often took the omnibus to his office. He was known for his punctuality and dedication, working 8 solid hours a day, sometimes bringing sandwiches to avoid going out for lunch. Despite his work ethic, Wernher enjoyed life, smoking, drinking, gambling modestly, and playing billiards on what was said to be the most luxurious billiard table in Europe. By the 30th of May 1906, Julius wrote that Beat's condition had worsened significantly, with an unusual accumulation of dangerous symptoms, and his life was hanging by a thread. Although Beat experienced a brief and remarkable recovery, he eventually returned from Wiesbaden, bringing his doctor, as he wished to die at his country house, in Water. Julius was one of the few allowed to visit him. With a heavy heart, Julius hosted a reception at Bath House for an official visit by members of the German press. An account of the event was published in the Anglo-German Courier, featuring a photograph of Birdie, now a confident society figure, adorned with a magnificent pearl choker and ostrich feather cape. The article reported on the event and Birdie's status in society. At midnight, many editors visited the residence of Sir Julius and Lady Wernher, who welcomed their friends. Bath House in Piccadilly, though not as grand as the Stafford Mansion, was perfect for such events, characterized by the homely kindness and courtesy of the hosts. It was no surprise to see a continuous stream of visitors from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. Lady Wernher, elegantly dressed in a chic pale blue satin gown, looked her best as she received guests, including notable South Africans and a host of London celebrities from politics, art, literature, and drama. On the 6th of July, Julius suffered a severe attack of shingles and was still very ill when Beat died on the 16th, preventing him from attending their dear friend's funeral. The obituaries for Beat were numerous and varied. Fitzpatrick noted that only a few close friends knew the real little Alfred. To Fitz, Beat was a kind man, the opposite of the popular view of a sordid and vulgar Hoggenheimer. Journalist W.T. Stead remarked to Fitz at the funeral, "There was something Christ-like about Alfred Beat." However, for some, particularly radicals, the Jameson raid had forever tarnished Beat's reputation. The Daily News sarcastically noted Beat's inglorious role in one of modern history's most inglorious episodes, subsequently dedicating himself to amassing and spending millions. Radical MP John Burns described him as the vampire, an octopus drawing out the lifeblood of South Africa. At his death, Beat was still believed to be the richest man in the world, though William Rockefeller and George Westinghouse might have had greater fortunes. The assets of Wernher Beat were estimated at least £100 million. Officially, Beat left about £8 million in shares, which were then at rock bottom. Much was made of the successful combination of Beat and Wernher's contrasting characters. Beat, excitable, intuitive, quick in decision, optimistic, boyish; Wernher, cautious, difficult to convince, clear-visioned, stolid, wise. Both avoided publicity and possessed the German gift of thoroughness. The New York press compared Beat's capacity for thinking incontinence to Rhodes. Julius Wernher, on the other hand, was said to be rather at sea when it came to imperial matters, as Joseph Chamberlain noted. Julius was more of a disciplinarian than a hustler, unlike Abe Bailey and Rhodes's friend Rochefort Maguire. The final sentences in Beat's entry in the Dictionary of National Biography perhaps serve as the best epitaph. An active sympathy with every form of suffering and an ardent belief in great causes led him to distribute vast sums of money, and his benefactions were always made privately with rare self-effacement. The terms of the will give the true measure of his character. His will was sensational, changing many ill-wishers' opinions. Its benefits are still felt in southern and central Africa today. Beat's tombstone at Tuin bears the words, "Write me as one who loved his fellow men."